So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Melissa and just what she was talking about in the last activity and an implicit bias. And thank you so much for bringing this to our awareness, because we're going to be talking today about safe spaces and places for difficult conversations. And I just wanted to highlight the word difficult, because the process of facilitating these types of interactions are so nuanced, and like, we're not trying to scare you away from this, but just to kind of shed some light on how maybe even biases come into our perceptions, and they influence how we might be reacting to people. So just from reflecting on the last DIE, how sometimes most times we don't know what the other person's lived experiences are, right? And even if we are familiar with their lived experiences, we haven't experienced those ourselves. So I wanted to talk about like the open-mindedness that comes into being able to say, okay, I'm having a reaction right now. I'm noticing that I am feeling this way. And also being, not jumping to those evaluations that are so easy to go to as like a go-to, like, oh, he said this, that must mean this. Oh, and all of a sudden we're spiraling into this circle. So thank you so much for leading us through that activity and bringing that to our awareness. So to kind of kick off today, we're going to go through a framework, and then also process and a little bit of some tips and tricks and hacks about how to guide these difficult conversations. And I want to say guide because we're not going to control them, but kind of guide them along the way. And so I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, and then we also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So we'd be happy to hear about your guys' experiences as well.
Okay, so thank you for the last training as well, that activity. I appreciated that DIE, especially if people sound differently, look differently, just hold the phone for just a minute. And I always like that, because when I start speaking, they're like, wait, hold on, you're from the South? No one from the South is out here. I can't understand what you're saying, all that. So I really appreciate that. And my name, since you asked what, I'll give it to you, but I'm with family right now in Florida, and they're all telling me, oh my gosh, why do you have all the names, but it's Cutrer-Párraga. So it's a real mouthful. So thank you for asking me about the name. And so we all know names are important. We're going to start off here today with the first thing when we're thinking about difficult conversations. And, thinking about that previous activity that we just had with DIE, I'm not going to say the other word, but with DIE, even when you hear the word difficult, what do you think of when you hear that word, and what does that mean? Okay, well, it's going to be difficult because all of the rest of the people except for me are all jacked up, and so that's why it's difficult. Not difficult for me. If they had listened, maybe, or that sort of thing. Well, we're going to start off with saying, okay, anytime we're heading into one of these conversations, or many of you may be in situations where you have to help others understand something, or you may also be on the receiving end. But if you're in a situation where you're in a space where you're going to help others or support or scaffold others, and we include ourselves to continue learning about having one of these difficult conversations, what Cynthia and I have discovered is, and the literature bears this out, is that it's really important to know who is the audience and what is the purpose. Because the hacks that we're going to give you a lot of times are really dependent on who's in the audience. So is it a mixed cultured audience? Is it an in culture audience? Is it an out of culture audience? And that sort of thing. And that's going to be really, really difficult. So I'll give you an example. If I'm teaching a multicultural course and all of my students are ethno-racial majority, so they're all white students, the way that I go about helping students to see their biases and their privileges and that sort of thing may be a little bit different than if another type of audience is there. So we just want to keep that in mind, like, what is the audience and what is the purpose of that? So along with that, with our next slide here, you're going to start to see that the first thing in creating and having these difficult conversations is to create that culture of learning. So my background, I'll give you a little bit of my background. I am an educator. I spent a lot of years. So I'm from Florida. I'm from North Florida, and a lot of people don't realize that North Floridians have this type of accent. We do. Here I am. But I've taught in a lot of different places. So I taught school. My undergraduate degree is out of Miami, and I actually taught in what at the time was the largest high school in America. There were over 6,000 students in that high school. And you can imagine they're all very, very diverse in that high school. And also I've taught all over the country in different areas, and now I landed in Utah. But what I want to share with you is when we are thinking about individuals who are adult learners, they have several things in common when they want to learn. So whenever we want to share like a difficult conversation, one of the important parts is to think about, okay, well, the people in this conversation are adults. Now, we all know there's a difference between adults and, I mean, we all can be adults numerically, but growing ourselves up, and I'm talking about myself too, growing ourselves up is a whole different thing. And then, so part of this is to help grow our own selves up. So when we're thinking about the folks that are going to be members or participants of a difficult difficult conversation, one of the things is to create a culture of learning. So I just want to talk just a minute on learning theory. And we know that if learners, especially adult, even children, but adult learners feel like they're going to be judged or attacked, their ability to learn really, really, really goes down. That's why I really appreciated the previous activity where we're like, okay, first we just have to describe what we're seeing and what's going on versus do we feel like we're being attacked when we're in a difficult conversation? So learners with a mindset that they're going to be judged or something might happen to them are much less likely to become involved with learning that involves risk or making mistakes. And then, as we all know, we don't have everything down on lock. We don't know all the pieces, and there are a lot of different pieces flying around in difficult conversations. So adult learners who are in a conversation when it's going to be difficult, if they're feeling like that they may come to harm or they're going to be judged or something like that, they're much less likely that even if they do make mistakes or have made mistakes in the past, they're much less likely to try to correct the mistakes. Rather, what they do is try to hide those mistakes, and they won't disclose or discuss or be transparent about what needs to be learned. We also know in some of these conversations, especially if they're cross-cultural, there is an idea that, okay, we want individuals to learn. I mean, we ourselves want to continue to learn, and that requires critical reflection. But we also know from the research that critical reflection requires trust and a trusting atmosphere where we can make mistakes without worrying about that. One last thing I want to say about this in creating a culture of learning and trying to make an environment where folks can learn. Cynthia's going to talk more about that in just a minute, about what a space means and about vocabulary. But one of the things we know from the research is that just from the jump, if we perceive that we're going to be in a situation where it's a threatening conversation and we feel like we're either going to be threatened or whoever we're talking to may feel threatened and we're not really, really centered, this causes the brain. There's a lot of research on this that says that it causes the brain to have several reactions. One is to lose the ability to correctly interpret learning clues from the environment. Like, okay, so the previous presenter talked about, looking at this picture and just trying to describe what's going on. But if we feel like we're in a threatening environment, then it causes the brain not to be able to have as good of an ability to do that. Also, it causes the brain to have a less ability to have tried and true behaviors or behaviors that have been helpful before, and rather focusing on maladaptive behaviors. It causes the brain to lose ability to index, store, or access information, which is really important, and also causes us to become limited in our responses or to perceive different types of relationships or patterns, which are really, really important in difficult conversations because we want to make connections and have that. And also, it makes our higher level learning go down. And we also lose long-term memory capacity related to what we're talking about. And sometimes folks, even when they feel like they're in a conversation that seems threatening, will then display phobic type behaviors. And I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation where someone felt really threatened and they're saying, oh, this is going to happen, and I know you're thinking this or that. But that's why, if they're perceiving it to be threatening, these types of things can come up. So I think now, with that background, we'll talk a little bit about some shared vocabulary.
So one of the things that Beth brought up is kind of some grounding exercises and grounding activities to go in before we even have these conversations. So if you were present in the opening session, we had a tough conversation. Some people mentioned that they were feeling triggered. Some people were overwhelmed. Some people were overstimulated. And Melissa was able to bring us back and say, let's take some deep breaths. Let's just kind of decompress here, and like being able to say that was difficult, and let's kind of be able to process that within ourselves. So I've also done these grounding exercises going into conversations, short mindfulness exercises that people can kind of check in and see how they are feeling before they even come to the conversation. Because we don't know, again, where they are. Were they rushing between meetings? They're not ready. Or they're already feeling defensive, or they're ready to throw down, and making sure that they're kind of have that connection and awareness of what they are feeling as they go into this. So the next one is that we usually start by establishing a shared vocabulary with our circles. Keeping in mind that the people involved may not or may be familiar with a lot of the lingo that we tend to throw around a lot in having these conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so also, like again, in our last exercise, there wasn't a common knowledge about what does implicit bias mean, and giving people the opportunity to ask those questions and not feel shamed about, what I don't know what you're talking about. So some of the shared vocabulary words that I've used frequently in these circles are to define racism and anti-racism. And anti-racism, I feel like that term, the way I define it, is actively working to acknowledge, confront, and eradicate language, behavior, and policies that are racist. So by using that term anti-racism, we're not saying racism doesn't exist. We're saying, hey guys, the goal of today is to actively acknowledge these things, confront them, and then work together to solve problems with racism. And so that starts off as a shared goal as well as a vocabulary word. We also like to bring to people's awareness the differences between intent and impact, and knowing that our intentions do not erase the impact that we have. Another thing is called calling out. If you guys have heard that before, like, oh, I'm calling you out for this, I'm calling you out for that. Usually calling out someone's behavior is more of a self-righteous scolding. Sometimes shaming is involved, or othering, but we like to use a term called calling in. And calling in is a way to challenge someone's prejudice in a way that you'd like to have your own prejudices brought to attention. So it's more of a kind of I'd consider like an empathetic joining together, or a gentle reminder that we are on the same team, and we are in this together, even as we have these different shared experiences. And then finally, this is one of my favorites, using a vocabulary word called ouch. So ouch, when something hurts us, we say ouch. So if I'm hearing something that impacts me, it's okay for me to say ouch, because that's a way of letting the person know that that had an impact. And the ouches don't necessarily have to be processed in the moment. They can be processed. It can be processed something afterwards, where I've seen someone say, hey, I noticed something I said affected you. Can we talk about that? So having that outlet and saying, ouch, that impacted me, is a good way to show in the moment that what's happening is impactful. Okay, and then Beth is going to talk a little bit about humanistic and disruptive approaches.
Okay, thank you so much, Cynthia. I've really learned from that, those ideas of calling out versus calling in. My first husband was Chinese, and I lived in Asia for 3 years. I taught school there in a kindergarten there for 3 years, and it was really interesting to live with with a Chinese family that was completely out of culture. For me, it was very, very good for me. And I really, really got very sensitive to that idea of calling out, or the idea of losing face, and how important it was to respect that. So that I love that difference between calling out and calling in. I'm looking in the chat too, and I'm really digging on this quote here, which is always seek first to understand, then to be understood, to acknowledge your past so you can do a little bit better today than yesterday, because you are who you are today because of the choices that you made yesterday, which really dovetails nicely into what Cynthia was saying, and also into this slide, which is these two different approaches to having these difficult conversations. So one has to do with it aligns more with the calling in, and almost two aligns with the anti-racism ideas, and that is the humanistic approach versus the disruptive approach. So I'm going to cover that very briefly. And then later on, we're also going to talk about the difference between healthy guilt and then shame, and how healthy guilt can actually be helpful and how shame is never helpful. So we'll talk about that as well. So basically, the humanistic approach is the idea that it's a humanizing approach where it engages individuals to make personal connections to learning and focus on what they can do and achieve, and how they can recognize the cultural and linguistic resources that those in the conversation can bring. The dialogue then is centered on this critical type of consciousness, and it enables people to learn to think actively with intentionality and purpose, and they think about their own contributions as well as the contributions of others. And also there is deep thought on their perpetuation of inequity, injustice, and oppression. It involves this commitment to critical self-reflection, to resist binaries like, okay, well, this is all good, this is all bad, this is this is that, but rather to think about, okay, we live in a pluralistic environment. So how do we go about this? And we really are mindful and as an anti-racist framework. The idea is also on the focusing on this development of social awareness, and so over social about how we develop our self-awareness, and how our self-awareness over social awareness then empowers individuals. And it helps to develop an awareness of internal ideologies and examine personal experiences. But in order for this to happen in these difficult conversations, it has got to occur in a learning environment where individuals can experience spaces where they can be vulnerable, and how they can learn to create like a courageous atmosphere to increase an individual's ability to sit in difficult emotion, and then to grapple with what triggers them, and then how to move beyond those emotions to a useful action for change. So I really appreciate what Cynthia said, like in an earlier presentation, folks are feeling triggered. It was a really hard conversation and that sort of thing. But when we have, along with that, as we have a humanistic approach, we want to build that ability to be able to sit more in difficult emotions and really grapple with those triggers, and then try to move beyond that to a space where we can have discipline with the emotions and have action for change. And when I say that, I really am thinking about white fragility and that sort of idea, where it's like, oh, well, everybody is racist and all kind of people have racism, like that, versus and being so defensive to a space with, okay, let me sit in these emotions, let me sit with these things, and let me think about what these things actually mean and what could happen, as I am able to sit in this difficult conversation, and as I'm able to have an open mind, and as I'm able to learn and tolerate other thing, or have more stress tolerance or defensiveness tolerance, we say sometimes. Okay. Now, when we talk about the disruptive approach, ironically, that is the most, that has been the most typical approach to difficult conversations, particularly cross-cultural conversations. A lot of times it's been called the damaged center approach. And in this approach, it's the idea that we destroy everything to come up with something new. Everything is out. And the problem with that is, although, when we're talking about institutional racism and all that, certainly there are spaces where, let's burn the barn down type of thing. But at the same time, this type of approach in many different situations has been shown to actually, it causes shame for one thing, but also, ironically, the unintentional outcome of that is it reinforces colonialist beliefs, which is a very negative outcome. It escalates individuals' defensiveness and negative dispositions. It ultimately serves to defeat purposes of these conversations. It actually has been shown to increase occurrences of microaggressions, and also microaggressions like, okay, silence, or to create an atmosphere where folks that are in a difficult conversation fear to say the wrong thing or to act in the wrong way. And I guess the most, one of the strongest outcomes of it is that it has not been shown to translate to any type of modified behaviors in the environment.
So we want to hear a little bit from you about, the next part is we're going to talk about these creating conversation guardrails, but we want to hear about you, from you. Has anyone ever had an experience where one of these conversations, in your opinion, has gone terribly wrong? Maybe you have been a facilitator of a conversation and it was not what you expected. So we'd love to hear if you guys like to unmute your microphones or put something in the chat. Tell us about an experience when a conversation has gone wrong.
Hey, there's an experience that I had when I was incarcerated. A lot of people hide behind their pride because they worry about what other people think about them. So humility, I see, is the key to a lot of this communication thing, because all you have to do is action. So that way you can avoid all the assumption and the evaluation. You'll find the truth, nothing but the truth, instead of sitting there assuming. That's what I.
Do you have any suggestions about how to remain humble in a conversation?
Like, to me, how I stay humble is I just remember when I was back in the island, just wanted to be out here, and sometimes I lose sight of it. But I always when my auntie and stuff calls from the island, it helps me, because what I see out there, they barely have anything. So just being out here, having whatever it is, what helps me avoid all of it. But humility is really the key. I feel like it's the key to this process, because pride stops us from our full potential. That's what I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Even our how we approach these conversations. Again, back to what Beth was saying. Are we here to confront? Are we here to learn? Are we here to grow? Are we here to build? Like those different purposes for the conversations. And if we are to do those constructive things, I do believe it starts with humility as well. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have a conversation that went terribly wrong, or maybe not even terribly wrong, just maybe not even living up to what you or the experience was different than what you had hoped for or planned for?
I can go if someone hasn't gone yet.
Please.
Good morning. I think for me to think about a conversation that has gone totally left, I think I was trying to bring up a conversation about police brutality in a space in my church. Good morning. And I brought it up in this space, in a safe space in our church where we talked about it, but very informally. And I wasn't a facilitator. I was just posing questions for us to talk about. And the conversation completely went left, where racism was like a lot of microaggression words were coming in, a lot of blaming victim, victim blaming, a lot of racist conversations started happening. And then it went to where I felt like I did more harm than trying to than trying to just have a conversation to bring up a lot of awareness into our community. And I felt very helpless because it was in the church, and we had leaders in there, so I didn't feel like I had the power or authority to be able to step in as a facilitator. And I did the worst thing that you can do. I didn't say anything. I just let everyone say what they needed to say. I took a lot from it myself, and I did definitely change a lot of the way that I thought about a lot of people in my church just because of the things that they said. However, I wanted to say that this was probably about 7, 8 years ago. I did stand up for what I actually believed in because I felt like what Joe was saying. I didn't want to seem like I was the one that's trying to come and stir trouble. Now I welcome it. Now I want to stir trouble. I'm the troublemaker. But yeah, that kind of conversation in a space where we have different protocols rather than the protocols that I'm used to as a teacher. And when you're talking about the kind of conversation that went left, for me, it's always about race, and it's always about police and their roles in our society.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Tovel. As you're sharing that experience, it's reminding me of just even hosting these types of conversations, like how anxious I feel, how much I'm already on guard. I'm white knuckling, like literally like, oh, I don't know what's going to go wrong. And sometimes even sharing that, that anxiousness with our participants, like, I don't feel like I have the answers. I'm nervous about this conversation. How are you guys feeling about this conversation? Is a good opener as well. But as I listen, you use an interesting word, troublemaker, but as I hear you sharing your experience, it sounds like you were, as the years have progressed, become more comfortable with those uncomfortable spaces, like Melissa was saying. So what we want to talk about is conversation guardrails and what they're kind of designed to do. If you look at this picture here, they're not like along the entire route, but they're just more in the dangerous territories, right? And they're usually placed in the trickiest areas where it's easy to take a wrong turn. Sorry. So putting guardrails is not about control. It's about putting a context around the conversation. And we like to post these in chats and also put them on slides and discuss them in the beginning, so we can all kind of have this shared agreement about what is appropriate to say and what we want to be careful and wary of. And so some of the ones that we use are being respectful of other people's thoughts and emotions, using I language from speaking from our own experience, avoid speaking up on behalf of others and using the words like they and them, and also avoiding assuming that we know what others' intentions are. So we also set consequences for going beyond these guardrails. And the first one is we usually ask people, it's just a gentle reminder, please follow the rules for these forums. But then it does, the next step is that we will unmute people, and the third time we will remove them from the meeting. And this is also to say, these conversation guardrails are taken seriously. It's not just something like nice to know, let's all keep this in mind. It's no, these are real consequences. And ways for us to hopefully better engage with each other. So the next part is we're going to talk about the difference between safe spaces and brave spaces. And knowing the difference between the two is important, because I've gotten in trouble where I'm in trouble in terms of thinking that I was creating a safe space for people. And in reality, it wasn't at all. And it completely turned into something that was quickly spiraling in a different direction. So we define safe spaces as a place or environment where a person or category of people can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, and other emotional or physical harm. And then the second feature of it is that this place is usually for marginalized people to come together to communicate regarding their experience with marginalization. So I'll bring up an example that Dr. Tovo talked about, police brutality. What would a safe space for police brutality look like, as opposed to an open forum about what people think about police brutality as either a policy or so how, with that like difficult topic, how would you create a safe space, and who would that safe space be for?
I can answer, or I can give perspective. I would not host it at a police department, and I wouldn't host it necessarily in a I would just not host it at a police department. I would try to find a neutral space, whoever the convener of the meeting is, to find a space that's both safe for police to be able to engage in honest conversation and community members. I would definitely put, group agreements or conversation guardrails to ensure that there is respect and that there's some ground rules into engagement to ensure that there is safety in the conversation. I think you have to have a strong facilitator who's neutral, who doesn't have a stake in the conversation, to be able to guide the conversation. Yeah, and definitely a lot of pre-work would have to go into a conversation like that. I don't think we should just be like, okay, we're gonna have a conversation about police brutality, but there needs to be some groundwork that happens before engaging in a very difficult conversation. It's a highly charged topic where officers often feel attacked and communities often feel unheard. So I would just really try to be mindful of all of that dynamic in creating a safe space.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Any other ideas for creating that safe space for hard topics? I'm curious, Melissa, if you could talk a little bit more about this pre-work, because when you think about these conversations, usually, out 1 hour, 2 hours, I actually think about it as like a 3-part series, and this is only one of them. And there's actually, should be like some pre-work and also some post-work that happens at the end, because this conversation, it's not an end all, right? We want conversations to continue, to perpetuate, and to be able to keep those going. So yeah, what kind of ideas do you guys have, or, well, and Melissa in specific, like pre-work, a quick example of something you've done to like set some pre-work?
Yeah, setting expectations, right, is what are the expectations of everyone involved to be able to engage in the conversation? What are the objectives and goals of bringing people together to have the conversation? Is it to, I always think of this in like three parts, like when we're doing, so I facilitate, I facilitate meetings with law enforcement and community all the time. And we really use this three-prong approach around, systemic change, internal personal change, and action, right? And so collectively, those things can't happen by just one side. And so those expectations have to be very clear in the beginning, because if it's just community members who just want to tell police that they don't like them, they don't like what they do, they profile or whatever that is, who is that helpful for, and what could a possible next step action be if that's the only thing happening in this meeting, right? So being very clear about expectations, being very clear about the objectives of the meetings. Normally it's just listening, right? And it's deep listening. So if that's the goal, then let's make that the goal. But it's just very clear expectations and parameters around these types of meetings, is that everyone's going to have an opportunity to speak. It's just not going to be one group speaking to the other and there's no response. But then we also have to be careful and craft responses and have some talking points ahead of time. I know I'm talking too much. Okay, I'm stopping.
No, I like how you said, who is this helpful for? And keeping that big question in mind is really like, what are we trying to do? Kind of taking like that bird's eye view and then crafting the rest of it accordingly. Whether it's the specific guardrails, specific talking points, specific airtime that you're giving, open forum. So there's a lot of different considerations. The next one, as opposed to safe spaces, there's a place called brave spaces. And these brave spaces are different because they're inclusive to all races, sexes, genders, abilities, immigration status, lived experiences. It's a way for participants to express themselves, challenge each other in a positive way, and be held accountable for their mistakes and learn from one another. So the guidelines for brave spaces are being a willingness to label racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. Brave spaces, we're also letting others know that we are willing, that we also feel offended. So by using like the words ouch that we talked about, and then giving people time to respond and reflect within the meeting and outside of the meeting by using their I language, like I am feeling this, I am feeling, sometimes silence is an interesting thing that comes up in both safe and brave spaces, and silence isn't always something that's negative, right? Knowing, for example, if I posed a question, the silence, if I interpreted the silence right away, or then I might be off on that, because knowing people need time to process. People also need time to just check in with their emotions. People may need, there's lots of different ways to use silence as actually like a tool for reflection times. And then finally, in brave spaces, we try to navigate the tension between saving people and being an advocate or an ally. I recently had a conversation at my university, and ironically, it was about LGBTQ rights, but most of the people who were actually talking were not from the LGBTQ community. They were talking on behalf of the LGBTQ community. And we had to point out that that was not necessarily like just the different dynamics and what was happening in there to actually give voice we pointed out that voice is important, but we weren't hearing the voices that we were actually like talking about. So we had to do some redirection there. And finally, so we're going to talk a little bit about some cautions and then give you guys a chance to ask any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate what's been said thus far. And I wanted to follow up with that with caution. So I wanted to talk about two things. One is speaking for others. I want to talk just briefly about white savior industrial complex, and then I want to talk about the differences between healthy, unhealthy guilt, and then shame. So the first thing I want to talk about is speaking for others. And I'm going to be a little self-indulgent here for a minute and just, just give a little preaching to myself as well. Okay. So I'm about to preach. I'm about to bring us to the word. Okay. So my first husband was born and raised in Asia. He's Chinese, and then immigrated later to the States. And then after we were married, and then my second husband, it was born in Ecuador and came to New York City as a 15-year-old, and then lived and grew up the rest of the way in, he's still growing himself up now, but he's trying to do a really good job. So I'll just have to say that. But one of the things that I have to caution myself, I'm going to call myself out. That's why I want to preach, but I'm preaching to myself too. I'll call myself out for a minute. And that is, y'all look, I'm pasty. I'm a little pasty white little girl here. Okay. No, I'm getting my tan on since I've been back in Florida, but I'm still a little pasty. And so what I want to say is, this caution for speaking for others. So like I cannot, I have biracial children. I have friends of many diverse races, but I cannot speak to my husband's experience as a member of the BIPOC community, my first husband, although my current husband says, no, I'm your first husband, baby. Keep that in mind. So, yeah, I cannot speak for that. And so like Cynthia talked about, they're in this LGBTQ environment and the folks who are speaking or not. That message or that type of thing goes right along with white savior industrial complex, which means that I am, because I'm white, I'm going to save all the poor little children who are of color. Now I always push back and say, you're doing that because you wish you had some Flavor Flav, but whatever, you don't. So you're trying to save people. Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but here I am, world. Hello. But what I want to say about that is this. Before I came, so I'm currently at BYU. Before I came to BYU, I was at UNC Chapel Hill. One of my very best friends who was there, she is a Black woman, a leader in the community. And my background is specifically on teaching diverse students, especially minoritized students, how to read. Okay, especially students who have a really difficult time learning how to read. And I just happen to be good at that. I don't even know how, but I'm good at it. And I felt really, really strongly that all children have a right to learn how to read. But I noticed that a lot of my colleagues who happen to be white are like, no, for these little Black children, we just need to love them. So when I was talking to my colleague who is Black, Dr. Horner, she said that you're making an assumption that these little children are not receiving love. What are you talking about? Oh, we need to love them. No, we need to teach them how to read, even if it's difficult. We need to have high expectations, teach them how to read. So here's a little fact that people get surprised when they hear this, is that many states build prison space based on a 4th grade reading passing rates. So that means that states will do future planning and say, okay, this percentage of students did not pass 4th grade reading. Therefore, we need this many prison spaces, because it's that connected typically or correlated. And so, Martinette and I would always say, here are these little girls saying, yeah, we just need to love these children. I just need to love them. And Martinette would always say, where are you when they're in jail? Are you there loving them? Then no, you're not there loving them. And who's to say that you feel like that's your job and they're not receiving that? So it's a little bit of a caution to say, yeah, just like pump your brakes a little there. And I'm talking to myself, that old Chinese saying that you point one finger forward, got all your other fingers pointed back at yourself. So I'm saying that to myself too. The second thing that I want to talk about, I think it is very important for people in a humanistic approach too, to have an awareness of, yes, there is institutional racism. Yes, there are these biases that we don't recognize. And I teach a multicultural course, and it's interesting to get white students who are very privileged. They come in very defensive. They don't have any idea. And as you start to like move them across to like, let's see this, and oh yeah, there is. And we start to see that, I appreciate that process of people having an awakening, and then being able to start sitting in that uncomfortableness. As I'm saying that, though, I want to share my slide real quick. Oh, we're out of time though. Cynthia, what should I show? Should I show the slide real quick, or should I just? I want to hear people's questions.
Please
Show
show.
it. Okay, I'll show it real quick. Can you let me share, Cynthia? Was that on you, or I don't know who can let me share?
I just
Oh,
my
you did.
screen share, so
Okay.
you'll be able to now.
Awesome. All right, so I want to share this because I think it's a kind. I'm sorry for my messy screen there. Okay, so this is just going to show this here, the difference between shame, healthy guilt, unhealthy guilt, and those things. So they're not the same thing. And actually, in these difficult conversations, feeling helpful guilt is okay. Like this discomfort that something that has happened is wrong. Okay. And that it's caused by an action or a behavior that we can stop or we can change. We can act in a way that breaks these things. You know, we can, healthy guilt is potentially a positive. It helps us to ask for forgiveness and correct a wrong. This can lead to healing. But if you jump now, unhelpful guilt is kind of like, I have these really crazy perfectionistic ideas. So I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on that, but that's that. I want to skip over to shame because of time. The difference between helpful guilt and shame is that helpful guilt is, okay, I did something wrong. I did something wrong outside of myself. So I had the ability to change and think about that. But shame is that I am myself flawed. I am myself worthless. I am myself inherently defective. And this actually, shame can start earlier than guilt. And it can stay with us longer. This idea that we're unworthy, we're deeply flawed. And then what happens is we tend to reject or stay away from that which we feel is shaming to us. So in these conversations, and like I said, I'm talking to myself too. I'm just going to stop sharing there. The idea is that we don't want to have the shame response, because that's an inherently flawed, like I am flawed. I can't do anything. I am just, because in myself, inside of me, I'm bad, flawed, whatever. Rather than, okay, I can open my mind. I can change the way that I'm thinking. I can develop skills. I can learn DIE. I can learn how to do these guardrails. I can learn how to look at my own implicit biases. I can look at these things. And so I think that that is so important when we come to these conversations. And thank you for letting me share that a little bit. I will be quiet now.
Hey, and I love the quote that Martha put in the chat: shame blocks learning because shame activates that trauma response as well. So everyone, thank you so much for participating and listening. I believe we do have a break coming up. If we have time for Q&As, we're welcome to stay around, but if we need to take a break, we're also happy to continue these conversations after. Melissa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, we have some time for Q&A. We have break in about 10 minutes. So
Great.
Let's go ahead and take some questions. And I see Dr. Kavika Allen's hand up.
Kavika, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, but we can't see you.
Okay, I know Melissa's going to call me out on this again, so I'm going to show you where I am. I'm sorry, don't judge me. Here we go.
Oh, nice.
Alo, Kako. Malo, Alpito. This has been beautiful today. I am in the beautiful city of Orem. I'm at soccer games for my girls today. But I was just so empowered, so empowered. Oh my goodness, I felt the mana and the mana'o coming out, and I'm grateful for Dr. Wong and Dr. Cutrer-Párraga, who are so good and are experts in this area, and I learned so much from them. I appreciate them being a part of the poli-sci research team. And I just wanted to share one thing and that is I absolutely can connect at the personal level where we can make a lot of changes and differences and create safe places and spaces and work on our self-awareness. These are very, very important parts of making change and being activists in our society. While at the same time, we need to realize that there are power structures in place. Power structures in place that sometimes kind of unmotivate us or get us in a place where we don't feel like we can make a change because of the institutional power structures that are in place that sort of do not allow equity to kind of trickle down in terms of rhetoric and conversations to the lower management or others under the institutional powers. So what I mean by that is there have been some issues in my current institution where institutionalized racism and inequity was definitely clear, and people of color, students of color, faculty of color, staff of color are experiencing this. And you know, while there has been a committee that has been put together and charged with addressing and reconciling these issues, and I feel somewhat optimistic about it, there are still issues, not only at my institution, I'm assuming, but most institutions where those in power make decisions and they make alliances. And if they don't have those who have been marginalized, those who have been oppressed, those who don't have sort of awareness of those who've been colonized over decades and decades, they may not make the right decision and be aware of what really the real issues are. And so Beth might know a little bit about my experience. You know, this might be another conference to talk about, but I definitely felt it at my institution, other institutions. I'm sure other folks have felt it. But if we come together as a people, of course, individually at a personal level, and then build our collective effort, hopefully we can bring more change and awareness to the institutional level, which I think I personally have issues with. And this has been a real struggle for me and others I've heard from at various locations at my institution. So I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for this conference, for Melissa, for Susie, my wonderful, beautiful aunties, everyone who has been a part of this conference, because it gives me strength, it gives me empowerment, it gives me ways that I can be inspired to continue forward and change what I can, and then move up and change other higher structures, you know, that need to be changed. And so I'm so grateful, very, very grateful for all of you, and keep up the good work. I've just been so uplifted, not by the soccer games, but what has been said this morning. Thank you so much for uplifting me and inspiring me this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. There's some other hands, Dr. Wong. Martha.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to kind of just share the experience I had while I was facilitating the Women of Color support group at the Rape Recovery Center. It was a movement to dedicate that brave space to women of color survivors. It felt very important to me. And I learned so much also even about my own trauma through that group. I guess what I wanted to acknowledge is the difficult work, talking about the word difficult, right? Just this difficult work of navigating the intersectionality of many identities, because we were all from different cultures and ethnicities, and we're yet had similarities in oppression and marginalization. And it not only was taking a lot of work for them, and I love what you said, Melissa, about setting expectations. I would definitely make sure we had an initial meeting before they would join the group, because we would talk about the difference between a safe space and a brave space, and setting those expectations to learn how to feel, not to feel good, right? But to learn collectively how to feel, and hence heal together. But it took a lot of work from me too. I would meditate 10 minutes before starting that group. I would sometimes feel my own trauma response, because it was very triggering for me as well. So I feel that the work is most powerful when we all do that work, including the facilitators, to stay present and to stay connected with your felt sense. And this brings me about listening to the eyes that we were talking about yesterday. And that to me was just like a sign that if someone truly takes the time to listen through the eyes, it's because you're grounded in that moment and you're present. And yeah, so kudos to everybody who does these brave spaces, because it takes a lot, not only for the participants, but for the facilitators.
Thanks, Martha. Love that you're here. Any other questions, comments? Anyone want to underscore any sections of the presentation?
Hey, Melissa.
Yes.
I just wanted to add on to like a lot of things that just were on point to me today in this presentation, and talking about the reading, teaching them how to read and assuming that they're loved. I think there's so many assumptions made about our communities, that are of oppression. And when I think about what Dr. Kavika shared, about moving up and being in places where we can be a part of that decision-making process, that's so important. And that's why I connected those two comments shared, because I think that's why we are what we are where we are, is right. They're trying to oppress us and keep us where we are so that we don't come together. We don't like build capacity within our communities so that we are able to be in those power seats that make these decisions. And I love these conferences because it provides us that opportunity and those brave spaces to feel empowered that we belong there. We're never part of the conversation, and we need to be. And I don't think that our communities, or many of us, realize how important that is. I've heard a lot of conversation around Western education and all of that are negative, but it's so important for us to understand this Western culture, because that's how we're gonna reach those power seats that we need to be in. And so I just wanted to share that, because to me, this conference represents that importance of capacity building, and just everybody recognizing our role in our spaces, to give back and bring up our community members with us, instead of trying to take this all on our own shoulders and carry that weight.
Thank you so much, Retta, for that. Are there anyone else? I didn't want to move to our quick 5-minute break before not giving anyone else an opportunity to speak. Of course, chat is always open should you have anything you want to ask or something comes up for you. And if both of our presenters, there's been a few requests for the slide deck or some of the information that you were able to share today. If you can send that to Susie, and we can get it out to all of our presenters, or excuse me, all of our participants. A lot of great information and nuggets that people want to take. So I want to just highlight that I love that people are feeling empowered in the conference to be able to share difficult things and things that are maybe not popular or supported. And I just want to, also just underscore Dr. Allen, not sure if that's the most popular thing to say. Of course, this is a safe space and it needs to be said, but I want to support and uplift Dr. Allen for having courage to say that out loud. That's difficult. So I want to acknowledge that. And everyone else who's been able to share, even in the chat, a lot of brave things are being said. So I appreciate that this space has been safe and that it's encouraged bravery to be able to participate in the way that's most comfortable for you.